In 2020, because of COVID-19, traveling is out, but there's no reason you can't meet old and make new friends at an Agile conference. The Scrum Master Toolbox podcast teamed up with Tom Henriksen to organize the 4th year of the Agile Online Summit, and you can attend for free. There will be networking events, lots of talks on important topics, and 8 amazing keynotes from Mary Poppendick to Alan Holub, Jeff Patton, who's the creator of user story mapping, Neil Killick, who's a no estimates pioneer, Jeff Watts, author of Scrum Mastery, a great book for Scrum Masters, Jeff Gotthelf, Bob Galen, and our very own Marcus Hammarberg, who's the author of the Bungsu Story, a great Agile transformation story. You can get your free tickets at bit.ly/SMAOS 2020. All lowercase, all one word. Once again, bit.ly/SMAOS 2020. All lowercase, all one word, and the link is also on the show notes. You can get your free ticket or opt for the full digital access that lets you keep all the conference videos forever. And for example, organize Agile learning sessions at work by watching those videos. You can get the full digital access at bit.ly/SMAOS 2020. But don't forget, there will be lots of live networking events, so I'll see you at the conference floor. Hello everybody, welcome to a very special episode of the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. This time we have with us for the 3rd time in a row for a retrospective masterclass, David Horowitz. Hi David, welcome back.
Oh, thanks so much, Vasco.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure. So for those of you who haven't listened to the first 2 modules of this retrospective masterclass, the link is up on the show notes, so be sure to check it out and follow the retrospective masterclass from the start. And if you have heard this before, then David is the CEO of Retrium, a platform for Agile Retrospectives that has powered over 100,000 retrospectives from thousands of companies across the world. And if you want to know more, you can go to bit.ly/better retrospectives. That's all one word, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/better retrospectives. So David, let's jump straight into the topic of today. Today we're talking about some facilitation tips to make sure we get the retrospectives off to a good start. So when we started facilitating retrospectives, and I still remember the first ones I facilitate, we are often focused on getting the structure right. And sometimes we even forget that insights can come at any time. This module is all about increasing our chances of facilitating a productive and in fact effective retrospective. So David, walk us through some of the most important norms or rules or established practices that you've discovered are really critical for a successful retrospective.
Yeah, so as you said, this is all about the open discussion that comes in a retrospective. A lot of us focus, I wouldn't say too much on the structure and the activities and the games, because that also needs a lot of our attention, but we perhaps focus not quite enough on what to do when people just start talking and there's more free-flowing conversation. So you mentioned group norms, and there's really 2 sides to that, right? So one is the group norms for the entire team. And the other is the norms for you as the facilitator. So let's start with the first one. So group norms for the entire team are things that really should be established in a working agreement that your team comes up with. Some examples that I've found to be particularly effective are start and end on time. Right? Mind blown. But so many teams don't. They start late and they end late, or they start late and they end early, or whatever the case may be. But what happens is that over time, that shows a lack of respect for other people who do show up on time, right? In terms of they may have other meetings to go to or other things to do. So starting and ending on time, to me, feel very important. But keep in mind, as I'm talking through these are what I've found to be effective as norms. And it's entirely possible that you and your team will find other things to be effective. Another one that I really like to have on teams that I work with is no sidebar conversations in the middle of a group meeting, especially a retrospective. There's a time and a place for breakout rooms and a time and a place for smaller group conversation, but those should be because that's what the team is doing and not because you feel like it. Usually a sidebar conversation, in my experience, is something that is there because maybe you're not talking about something relevant to everyone in the room, for example, or maybe people need a break and so they can't pay attention any longer. There's usually another hidden reason behind the sidebar. And then the last one I'll mention is, and this is probably my favorite one, a group norm around how decisions are made on the team. Because someone might come in assuming that, let's say, the most senior person on the team is the one who has the final call. They've been around the longest, they have the most experience, they have the final decision. Other people might come in saying, no, it's consensus. We all need to agree before we move on. And there can be hidden tension on the team if it isn't explicit on how these decisions are made. Now, I'll mention something. There's a website called thedecider.app, which I absolutely love. It's very simple. It just asks you a series of questions, maybe 5-6 questions about what type of decision needs to be made on your team. And then it tells you after you answer those questions, here's the decision-making model that makes the most sense for you. And there's maybe 8 to 10 of them on the site. And it's fantastic because it really helps you think through the options there. But being clear about decisions is a wonderful thing. So that's for the team. I also think it's important to talk about norms for the facilitator. And this is, in my opinion, at least, not something that needs to be a bottom-up working agreement that the team agrees to and adopts, but instead just something that the facilitator shares very clearly, very explicitly with the team, maybe even before the first time they facilitate a retrospective with them. But just to be clear that my job as the facilitator is to help everyone on the team to do your best thinking in this conversation. So I'm going to stay impartial. I don't have a stake here. And sometimes that means that I'll just let you all talk. Other times I'll intervene to make sure that everyone has a chance to participate. But just sharing kind of your mindset of how you think you need to act during the conversation can get everyone on the same page about what to expect.
One of the things that, as facilitators, we need to be aware of is that these norms, which, you just shared some of those that work for you, at the end of the day, they need to be set together with the team. Now, it's perfectly okay to come with a prepared list, like, the one you just suggested, but it's also important to give space for the team to kind of, chip in and put their own perspective on how they think they can do their own best thinking, right?
100%. I like to think of working agreements as a living document, that it's best if before the team even starts working together, the first thing you do is establish working agreements. But then you also come back and reflect and improve those across time, maybe even as frequently as once every month or once every 2 months. Just take a look at them. Maybe you don't need to change them, but also maybe you've discovered something or someone on the team has discovered something that would encourage you to change them. And the last point I'd make there is if there's some shock to the system, maybe there's a new business goal, maybe something like what happened this year in 2020 with COVID happens. If any sort of shock to the system occurs, revisit your working agreements, because it's entirely possible that they need to change to adapt to whatever has been modified in your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. It is in those moments of stress that we need the agreements the most, but of course we learn the most in those moments of stress. So it's good to go back and check if they still apply and maybe change some things. Like, for example, now we are all remote, so some of the agreements that were designed to be in the physical face-to-face world might not be necessary or might be even completely obsolete.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a team I was talking to that had a rule, which was if one person is remote, then everyone is remote, which is, I'm a big fan of this rule also. Basically just means that if one person is calling in to the meeting, then everyone else should call in too to level the playing field of the conversation, which at the time seemed like this kind of aggressive or very progressive type of policy and something that wasn't natural necessarily, but it was their working agreement. That's what the team had decided to do, and then COVID hit. And now that's a completely unnecessary rule because, of course, everyone's calling into every call. And so they just removed that from the working agreement for the time being. And if we ever, and hopefully we do, go back in person, they'll adapt to that again and discuss again. But these things change over time. It's not a static document.
Absolutely. And working remotely also presents new challenges. So one of the things that we might want to do is that once in a while, if not in all meetings, at least once in a while, we should agree to have the video on. because, humans also relate through the way they see others behave. And it's a lot harder to relate to and keep a closer relationship with our team members if we never see them, right? If they're just a name on a square.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's that same team that I was talking about initially when COVID first hit. They did not have that as part of their working agreement because they were not used to sharing video of their homes and potentially their messes and their kids and their dogs and everything else, right? But over time, they realized that, this is our new reality. So we need that person, human to human connection that we had before when we were in the office. So we're all just going to turn on video. But importantly, it was the team's decision to do that. No one imposed that rule on them. They discovered it themselves, and therefore there was a lot more buy-in than there would have been otherwise.
Absolutely. So, and what you just said kind of leads me to the next question. So you were talking about the team creating that rule together and they coming up with that. But of course, as facilitators, sometimes we need to step in, right? So one of the things that I find is the hardest to do when I facilitate, doesn't matter whether they are retrospectives or any other kind of meeting really, is to decide when to intervene and when to just step back and let things go. So Dave, what's your rule of thumb for when to intervene and, of course, when to step back?
Yeah, I'd love to say I have a rule of thumb that you can just use and rely on every single time and it's easy. But the reality is kind of closer to what you just said, Vasco, which is that it's hard. It's not easy to know sometimes when to intervene and when not. So over time, you build intuition there. But the way that I like to think about it, at least, is to return to the 4 jobs of a facilitator. So the 4 jobs of a facilitator, and this comes directly from a fantastic book that I highly recommend everyone reads. It's called The Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making by Sam Connor. And he talks about these 4 jobs. So the 4 jobs are, number 1, to encourage full participation on the team. Number 2 is to promote mutual understanding of the conversation. Number 3 is to foster inclusive solutions in the team. And number 4 is to cultivate shared responsibility on the decisions being made. So I mentioned those because the first 2 in particular are really helpful as a kind of a guidepost for you as a facilitator on when to intervene. So the first 2 are encourage full participation and promote mutual understanding. If you ever detect that, for example, some people aren't participating, there's just a back and forth conversation between 2 people on the team, then your job as a facilitator is to ensure that people have a chance to participate. And if that's not happening, you need to intervene to do something there. So, for example, you could pause the conversation and ask everyone to raise your hand if you have something to say. Maybe some of the more introverted people on the team just didn't feel like they could pipe up because this back and forth was happening between 2 of the extroverts, right? So just ask everyone, raise your hand if you want to speak, and then give everyone a number. You're 1, you're 2, you're 3, you're 4, so that everyone knows that all 4 of those people will have a chance to pipe up. Another example there, the second role that I talked about of promote mutual understanding, one of the second job of a facilitator. So if you are confused by something that someone said, then odds are at least one other person in the room is also going to be confused about whatever that statement was. And so it's your job then to ask clarifying questions to make sure that everyone in the room understands the comment. So rather than just doing what's natural, which is to say thanks and then someone else speaks up, try interjecting something like, it sounds like you're saying, and then paraphrase. Or let me see if I understood you, and paraphrase. And it's entirely possible that person will say, yep, you got it right, in which case now you know that everyone understands in the team. But it's also possible the person might say, no, that's not what I meant, and clarify it for you. And you can just keep asking, it sounds like you're saying, let me see if I understand you. And you keep doing that until you make sure everyone understands what the person said. So particularly those first 2, right? Encourage full participation and promote mutual understanding. Whenever you detect kind of a bug in the system for either one of those 2 things, I strongly encourage you to intervene. And, I'll say one more thing, which is that when I first started facilitating, I felt these things were very awkward. Incredibly awkward to interject and to try to facilitate in that way. But overcoming that awkwardness leads to a better conversation for the team. So make sure that you share with your team that this might be awkward, this might feel unnatural, and we're going to collect feedback on how this went as we go so that we make sure that everyone's comfortable with this. But try it, because if people don't understand things and people don't have a chance to participate, no wonder we have this issue of low engagement in retros.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to low engagement, there's a topic you share quite a lot about in this module 3. You talk about the 10 most common challenges you've seen during open conversation, open discussion. I'll put the link to that module on the show notes so people can go and read them one by one. But this encouraging of open conversation is perhaps one of the reasons to intervene. Like you said, right? If not everybody's participating, then maybe we want to open the space up for others to come in and say, okay, so does somebody else have an opinion on this, instead of just having the same two people talking all the time, and sometimes even the same one person talking all the time, right? So share with us.
Yeah. And I loved how you worded that, by the way. I got to say that because you said, does anyone else have something else to say? Rather than something like, Jim, what do you have to say right now? Because, if you've ever been on the receiving end of that, it's very uncomfortable if someone calls you
Yes,
out
it
and
is.
you're not ready to speak up, right? So it's an open-ended invitation as opposed to a calling out of an individual. I had to
Yeah, or
just,
even just reflecting. Sometimes a little bit more assertive way to do it would be, I have the impression that some other team members want to come in, but they haven't given the opportunity. Does somebody else want to come into this conversation and share their perspective? Like you're a little bit pushing as a facilitator, but of course everyone has that feeling, right? When this most the person who steps most back in conversations, you know when they start I don't know, like, moving about in the chair, or twiddling their thumbs or whatever. There's always some kind of sign that they want to come in. And as facilitators, it's perfectly okay to kind of just, let's say, make a statement, open the space up so that others may feel that, okay, so now it's my turn. I wanted to say something. There was no silence. Now there is. Let me say it, right?
yeah, that's one of those things, again, where your intuition will build over this across time as you get more and more comfortable with facilitating. There's absolutely little giveaways that people want to participate but just can't figure out how. And things like moving around in the chair, for example, or opening their mouth like they're going to say something, but then not actually speaking. And you can mentally catalog that just to record who is giving you those indications to make sure that they have a chance to participate later. But another kind of natural way of making that happen is to use small breakouts. So if you have a 10-person team in a retro, use something like 1-2-4 all from Liberating Structures. If you haven't heard of it before, it's where everyone has a chance to brainstorm privately to themselves. That's the one. Then to have a one-on-one conversation with someone else about whatever the topic is, that's the 2. Moving on to the 4, where you have a smaller group conversation with 4 people. And then finally, the ideas are brought back to the larger group. And by shifting from a full group conversation over to these breakout rooms or breakout groups, what you're doing is you're providing the space for people to participate in a different way. So, for example, if someone wasn't able to get their word in with a larger group, as soon as they can talk one-on-one with someone else, they'll have a chance to participate and be heard. So it's not necessarily always just who else out there would like to say something, or I've noticed some people want to participate but haven't had a chance. It's also changing the way the conversation is structured that can help bring out these voices.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great tip, by the way. The 1-2-4 all facilitation technique from Liberating Structures, definitely worth checking out. Now, we were talking about this 10 common challenges because at the end of the day, our focus is to create that open discussion, right? So share with us some of those common challenges you see that prevent or make it difficult for us to have an open conversation in the retrospective.
Oh yeah, so in the module I talk about 10 of them, and obviously I can't go through all of them, so I encourage you to check them out in the module itself, because these are the things that come up time and time again. Now we've mentioned a few of them already. So one of them was 1 or 2 people don't participate. So we just handled that one. Another one that we talked about a bit before already was when people say things that are a bit confusing. So you ask these clarifying questions, right? It sounds like you're saying, or you keep repeating these things until you really understand what the content was. But there's a lot other ones too. So one, for example, is disagreements. Sometimes what you'll end up with is a really important topic of conversation, and there's just 2 loud voices in the room who fundamentally disagree with the direction we should head as a team, or the solution to the problem, or even earlier on, maybe what the insight we should be discussing might be. And maybe these two people don't get along and they tend to disagree, and everyone else just says, not again, right? I don't want to disrupt this conversation because these two people, they just go at it all the time. It's frustrating for everybody.
Yeah, and then they check out, right?
Yeah.
And then there's no conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the mistake that novice facilitators tend to make, and I still do this sometimes because it's so natural, and I always want to, but I know it's not the right thing, is to call out the bad behavior in the meeting. So to basically provide those two people with even more attention by saying, the way you all are talking to each other is not helpful, and we need to move on, right? That invalidates those two individuals' emotions. It invalidates their opinions, and then they feel even more frustrated than they did before. That might be how you're feeling as a facilitator. It might be how the rest of the team is feeling, but calling it out tends not to be too helpful. So the way that I tend to handle that, if I'm lucky, if I remember to do this, again, it's tricky sometimes, but is just to call for other responses, to say something like, does anyone else have a different opinion? Or to say, what do others think about this? It gives a chance for others to pipe up. The other way that I tend to handle this situation is to try to help those two people understand each other better, because a lot of times disagreements aren't actually disagreements about the fact. It's disagreements about something underneath the surface that is not apparent in the surface level of the conversation. Maybe it's that they just don't understand what the other person's saying. And so your job as a facilitator, again, promote mutual understanding, right? So say something like, hey, Leslie, what part of Bob's idea doesn't work for you? Or Leslie, can you restate Bob's point of view in your own words to try to build empathy and understanding of what the other person's saying, so that they feel validated, as opposed to pushing back and trying to derail the conversation. One other thing I'll say there is that it's important to show empathy for the feeling in the disagreement, because a lot of times disagreements, again, is not the facts really. There's something under the surface that tends to be more emotional. So you can say something like, hey, Isaac, it seems like you're frustrated right now. Is that the way you feel? And that, again, it feels very awkward to you as a facilitator the first time you do something like that. But again, if you validate their emotions, it gives them a chance to say, yeah, I do feel frustrated, and here's why. And sometimes just that simple statement can help you move on from the disagreement to something else. So, that's one of the top challenges that you definitely will face at some point as a facilitator, and it takes experience and practice to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have an episode, I'll put the link on the show notes, that talks about NVC. NVC is just an approach to try to respect people's emotions while at the same time make the conversation productive. So right, like instead of shutting down the disagreement, we actually explore, okay, so what's really happening, behind those words that we are exchanging. So I definitely encourage people to check that out, as that might be also useful input in this kind of situations.
Great, I love it.
So do you have some other challenge that you want to dive into, maybe one of those 10, or maybe something that just happened to you recently?
Sure. Yeah. One of the ones that happens with kind of newer teams that I've seen, and is that they tend to direct their comments to you as the facilitator or the scrum master instead of to the team.
That is a killer, I have to say.
Oh, yeah. Stop talking to me. This is a conversation for you, not for me. It happens also not just in retrospectives, but in other meetings too, like stand-ups. I see this a lot where it's like a status report to the scrum master.
Yeah.
And it's not the point of the stand-up, right? The point is to help the team.
So how do you handle it? I'm curious to see how you have been able to handle that.
Yeah, so the simplest thing that I would recommend is when someone looks at you and making a comment, is to simply respond by saying, what does everyone else think? And if you keep doing that every single time, it gets repetitive. Eventually people will take the hint. What do you all think? What does the rest of the group think? It becomes a waste of time to direct the comment to you, because they know you're just going to redirect to the rest of the group. So that's the first thing I'd recommend. The second thing I'd recommend is to, after you've tried that for a while, I actually just stay silent when they look at you, and they direct their comments to you, because eventually the silence. So let me back up. Silence is a powerful tool as a facilitator, because silence is very awkward, not just for you as the facilitator, but for the entire team. People have a natural tendency to want to fill the silence with something. So if people are talking directly to you, then if you just kind of look back at them and wait, eventually someone else in the team will respond. Or the person who made the comment to you will kind of look at the rest of the group around to try to get someone else to say something because they're starting to feel really awkward. And that can be a fantastic way to overcome that barrier, because eventually, again, they'll realize you're not going to respond to this. So it's better for me to talk to the overall group. So those are two ways that kind of subliminally will help people get out of that habit of talking to you instead of the broader team.
Absolutely. So these 10 challenges, there's more on the module, the link is on the show notes, of course, are some of the things that we really must be familiar with if we really want to foster open discussion. Now, everyone's got their list of anti-patterns that they've seen in these retrospectives or other meetings being facilitated by them. So definitely there's a lot of knowledge there that is worth checking out. So check out the module, and the link is in the show notes, as I said. Now, during these 5 phases of the retrospective, we talked about the 5 phases in the last episode, by the way, so check that out. We want to take advantage of this free-flowing conversation that we hope to create, that we hope to foster together with the team. One of the most satisfying things as a facilitator is when I see that the team makes progress together, kind of like they build on each other's ideas. They share ideas. They say no to some ideas. They say yes to others. They develop others, and everyone is bringing their best thinking, as you said, but also their energy is going up, and they bring different perspectives. They are not afraid of being judged. They are just sharing what their perspective is. But each phase, of course, of the retrospective is different. So what are your thoughts, David, on the idea of where does this free-flowing conversation fit in these 5 phases of the retrospective?
Yeah, so let's just go through one by one. So the first phase of the retro is setting the stage. And it's rare that you'll have an open conversation and set the stage, because this tends to be a fairly brief activity just to get people's feet wet and involved in the conversation. For example, if you have a one-word check-in at the beginning of the retro, you're not going to have an open conversation about that one-word check-in. So it's pretty rare that it happens and set the stage. And actually, I consider that, you mentioned anti-patterns, I considered it a bit of an anti-pattern in the set the stage. You don't really want open conversation then in most techniques. Okay, so step 2 of the retrospective is gathering data. So in this one, it depends. Usually not. Usually when you're gathering data, it tends to be, again, more data-driven, right? And so you'll have things, we've talked about timeline activity in one of the previous episodes, Vasco. And so for that one, people are just kind of putting what happened during the sprint up on the board at various times. And so it's more data gathering. But it's also possible that you will have a bit of an open conversation in gathering data, because if you, at the end of the timeline activity, to continue that example, you might say, well, what surprises you about what you see up on the board? And maybe you might argue that's shifting into generating insights, which is the next phase, maybe not. But usually at the tail end of gather data, there's some amount of conversation to make sure that you kind of generally understand what's on the board and people can talk just a bit about it. But when open conversation is more derailed, when it's not going well, it tends not to be in gather data on average. The 2 times that you really see this occurring are in the next 2 phases, which are generating insights and deciding what to do. Generating insights tends to be a fairly intense conversation. If 2 people have different perspectives on what might have happened, then you might end up in that disagreement scenario I just highlighted a moment ago. For example, if you're doing a 5 whys activity or a fishbone analysis during generating insights, people might get really into it during that activity. So even though you have a facilitation technique, and even though you're playing some game, you still end up with free-flowing conversation. And so these tips that we've been talking about become really important. And similarly, in deciding what to do, even after you've decided this is the topic we need to discuss the most, when you're trying to figure out, well, how do we run an experiment to change the issue that we're facing, there could be a lot of disagreement on the team again about what actually the next step might be. One person might feel very strongly that we need to do X, and another person might feel strongly we need to do something completely different. So figuring out how to facilitate the open discussion and deciding what to do is really, really important. And then finally, you have close the retro. And in that phase, again, it's fairly unlikely you'll have the open conversation. Most of the time, it's provide feedback to the facilitator or something short that just closes the experience for people. So it's really the heart of the retro. It's generating insights, deciding what to do, that all of this is critically important.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly where we want to make sure that everyone is bringing their best thinking, is entering the conversation, sharing their perspective. And when it comes to fostering that open conversation, in the module you mentioned 5 facilitation rules you live by, and one of them is actually quite close to my heart as I live in Finland. And if you don't follow that rule, you will for sure, in Finland at least, fail. And I'll let the listeners figure out which one that is. So walk us through those rules you take to every retrospective with you, David.
You have me very curious here. So I'm not I'm not familiar enough with Finland to know how this is. So I'll go through the 5 and then I'm gonna have to research this or talk to you. I don't know. It's funny. Okay, so the 5 rules for me as a facilitator that I always try to follow, irrespective of what type of meeting I'm facilitating. Doesn't have to be retrospectives, but certainly can be. So number 1, I mentioned this before already, which is being comfortable with silence. I'll tell a little story on this one. The last Agile conference, I believe it was Agile 2019 in Washington, D.C., I was giving a talk on retrospectives in front of, I don't know, maybe 300, maybe 400 people. I'm not sure. It was a packed audience. And I was going through some of the tips and tricks that I'm sharing with you today. And one of them is this: be comfortable with silence. And I put up a slide that said something like, be comfortable with silence. That's it. And I just stood there. And I just stood there. And then I kept just standing there. For a really long time, I counted slowly in my head to 10. 1, 2, and right, and I kept going. And not only did I get uncomfortable, you start getting physical sensations in your body of discomfort, but you could see everyone in the audience thinking, what is this guy doing? How long is he going to be silent for?
What kind of trick is he trying on us?
Right. I came to a talk, not a silent show, right? It was crazy. Everyone got uncomfortable, hundreds of people. But that was the point, was to show that you have to be comfortable with silence for the reasons we already talked about. So I think silence is underutilized, valuable tool for a facilitator. Get used to it. Okay, the second one is invite people. And I mentioned this again a little bit before. It's already weaved into the conversation today. But invite people, don't force people to participate. I'll go back to that same talk now that my head is in that space. So at that talk, the other thing that I did, and this was also wild and crazy, and it made people, again, very uncomfortable, to show why you shouldn't do this. I put up a slide and I said, hey, is anyone in the audience named, and I don't remember, Jim or Mary or whatever the name I chose? And a couple people, raised their hand, and I said, could you please stand up? And so they stood up. And, out of the 300, 400 people, there was maybe 5, 6 people who stood up at this point. And then I switched slides, and the slide said, now dance. So everyone named Jim and Mary in front of hundreds of people were just called out to dance, right? And a few of them did, and a few of them kind of bent down in shame and just sat down and hid because they wanted to run away. This is an extreme example of the discomfort that people have if you call them out when they're not expecting it, right? And so I was just demonstrating the point. But of course, in the facilitated experience in a retro, it's not quite as extreme, but still, I just don't call people out.
Well, it can be that extreme if there's a moment of tension even.
Yeah, absolutely. And for introverts, it can be very extreme. You have a lot of anxiety in situations like that, and it's just not the forum for you. So you need to be able to invite that participation and not force people, right? Okay, so that's the second one. The third one is monitor the energy of the group. These conversations can be very difficult and taxing, and sometimes even an hour is too much. And that pains me to say because I'm a big fan of retros, of course, so I want you to really dive in and spend enough time. But sometimes the energy drops. And as a facilitator, if that's the case, feel free to take a break. You could say things like, hey, let's just take 5 minutes, go get a coffee, go outside, come back, just make sure you're back in 5 minutes to refresh. Go outside for a moment, right? Or use the breakout groups like I talked before, 1, 2, 4, all. Some people lose energy from large group conversations, and some people gain energy from large group conversations. And similarly, it's also true for these smaller breakout groups. Some people are not so comfortable in one-on-ones, and other people are only comfortable in one-on-ones. So switching how the group talks to each other can change the energy of the room. So that's the third one. The fourth one is ask open-ended questions, not closed questions. So a lot of people have a tendency to ask questions that could be answered with a yes or a no. For example, would that help solve our problem? That could just be, yeah, I think so, or no, it won't. Right? But if you replace that with
That's not a very long conversation.
yeah, and you don't really gain anything from that. You don't gain any sort of insights or the explanation. I like to say replace it with wonder questions, or some people call them powerful questions. They're open-ended, inspiring questions that get people to think and share. So instead of, would that help? I wonder how we could make that even better. And then people start to think and share and reflect. It's a much better way of facilitating the conversation than the yes/no style question. There's a whole set of powerful questions that the link is too long for me to recite on the call here, but maybe I can share it with you, Vasco, and we can give it into the show notes for powerful questions.
Absolutely. We'll put that in the show notes. And powerful question is definitely one of those tools we should always have in our toolbox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they can be hard to remember and, again, a bit awkward when you first get started. So one thing you can do is print them out, one question per card, right, on index cards or something, and just have a few of them in your back pocket. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you taking a look at them in the middle of the conversation to remind yourself, here's some ways of phrasing the questions if you're new to facilitation. And then the last one I'd mention is remain neutral. The ivory tower version of a facilitator is someone who never takes a stake because their job is not to be a participant in the conversation, but instead to encourage the group who's having the conversation to make better decisions, to understand each other, full participation, all of that. And if you take a stake in or a side, then people will see you as not neutral. And as a result of that, will trust you less as a facilitator in your intent. For example, if you intervene and you shut someone's conversation down so that other people have a chance to speak, if you're neutral, that can be seen as a positive. But if you're not neutral, it could be seen as you just don't want that opinion to be heard. You want everyone else to speak up because you agree more with those individuals. So try your best to remain neutral. And if you can't, because for most people, you're a scrum master on the team that you're facilitating the retro for, so you kind of do have a stake, right? If you can't, then make sure it's obvious when you switch from facilitator to participant. I might have mentioned this before, I don't remember, but I use a facilitator's hat. Where I literally am wearing a hat when I'm facilitating that says facilitator on it. And if I take that off, people know then I'm a participant and therefore I can have a stake again in what's going on. And once I'm ready to go back to being a facilitator, everyone knows I'll be neutral. And that physical manifestation of who you are and your role can help. So those are the 5 rules.
That last one must be really hard for you as a CEO of your own company.
Yeah, so I don't do this anymore so much because, everyone assumes I always have a stake now. But back before I was a CEO, it was a lot easier.
Absolutely. But it is true also when we work with teams where there are these power structures, like, lead developers, senior developers, they might be lead QAs. The product owner even is seen as an authority figure in some teams. And to remain in that role as a facilitator allows us to be a peer with everybody on the table rather than trying to get the highest paid person in the room to make the decision. So the idea of remaining neutral is also important to give space for the team to come up with ideas without having to have all of those ideas come through the hierarchy in the team.
Yeah, completely. And I'll refer back to that working agreements conversation we had at the beginning of this podcast, where one of the things I like to put on the working agreement is how does this group make decisions? Because if there's buy-in on the team on how the group makes decisions, then even if there is someone in the room who has more power in terms of their hierarchical role in the company, right? If they've also agreed the way we make decisions is consensus or consent, then it becomes easier to ensure that that's actually what happens in the meeting as opposed to, well, what do you think, senior or lead developer, right?
Yeah.
And as for you as a facilitator, it makes it easier to remain neutral because everybody knows how we make decisions on the team. So we just refer to the working agreement as opposed to people looking to you as the facilitator. How are we going to end this debate? It simplifies everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a great note to end on. So, David, thank you very much. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so you can always go to retrium.com if you're a distributed team like everybody these days and are struggling with your retros. We have a platform to help you run better ones. So go check us out. Also on Twitter, I'm ds_Horowitz, or you can just shoot me an email, david@retrium.com.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll put all of that in the show notes. So, David, thank you again for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thanks so much for having me, Vasco. A lot of fun.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.